them getting rid of Donnie Walsh as fast as they did, it just seems like James Dolan should stick to playing in his terrible band.
But, well, I mean, is there at least a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel now with Phil, Phil and so?
I think with Phil, I do have hope. I don't think Derek Fisher was the right call. I think it's too early. I would have preferred Steve Kerr. But, I mean, because Steve Kerr, at least he's been out of the game a while. Once in the front office. I just don't like bringing the guy straight up into, coaching a team. I just find that to be, I feel like that's a disaster waiting to happen. But I'm not going to completely write it off yet. I'm going to be patient. I mean, it's been 40 years. What's the difference if I have to wait another 3 years for a finals?
Well, I can certainly appreciate that type of patience, but no, I mean, I hear you in terms of bringing a guy directly off the court. I had very similar concerns about Jason Kidd last year. They started terribly, but they had enough talent and enough veteran leadership on that team and clearly on the bench, to at least make a run. Some would say, and they would smartly say, that was that was probably because the Eastern Conference was absolutely atrocious last year, by and large, after the top one or two teams, or actually maybe top 3 or 4 teams. But with Derek, I mean, look, if you're a Knicks fan and you were expecting a title this year, regardless of whether it's Derek Fisher or Steve Kerr, then you're probably a little bit myopic. So I hear you. So I also hear you in terms of, waiting and seeing. I know there were some fans that were overreacting, after one preseason game. That's generally the case. Either people overreact on one side or the other. But look, if it's a new coach, new system, new play, working in some new talent. Obviously an entirely new basketball philosophy. And that's the thing that a lot of people that haven't been privy to, like Phil Jackson run team, whether he's coaching or in, now in the front office, it takes time. He's got to get his right people in there. Last year I was asked, hey, how long do you think before this? Honestly, I'm not going to put a date to it, but I will say I expect the first 20 to 25, maybe even 30 to 35 games to have some ups and downs. Some nights look really really poor as they're adjusting to the triangle. Some nights look looking pretty sharp, but look for them around the second week in January, a little bit after. If they're healthy, look for the watch those last 30 games and see if you don't see a stark improvement from the say the first 30. I do have faith in the direction that they're going, and I do think they're going to be a better team, especially as they move on from some of these the dead weight contracts that they have over these next couple seasons.
The contracts that they're going to have to, it's not like the players that are contracts are like everybody. This guy, yes, he's been injured, stuff. The Knicks realized the Knicks would not have Carmelo Anthony if it wasn't for Amari Stoudemire. They just wouldn't. And I don't know how many times I have to convince people of that. Amari made the Knicks an attractive destination because you think Melo would have okayed a trade to go play with Al Harrington and garbage like that. No, you just wouldn't. Nobody wanted to go to New York, and you know why? Because it was a bunch of garbage, and nobody wanted to play with David Lee because he was going to get paid a good contract after he left the Knicks, but he doesn't play defense, and he's not a superstar, but he's a really good player. And I mean, there was just nothing available for the Knicks to do. You had to get somebody out of that class of 2011. They wound up with Amari. And I honestly don't think that was I still stand by that move being a good move because it made an attractive destination. Yeah,
you know how people are. It's hindsight. It's after the fact. Oh, well, hey, look out. Look, I'll say this. I thought Amari got overpaid, but I don't blame Amari for it. And you know what tends to happen. Fans will blame the player, but at the end of the day, he didn't force Dolan's hand. He didn't force them to give him that contract. And in particular, the reason why they had to is for that exact reason. They had to be a viable destination again. You're not going to get that with Al Harrington. And no disrespect to Al Harrington, I actually I like him as a role player. He was good. He served his purpose. But that's not bringing in the big names. So I'm right there with you in terms of and the same goes for some of the smaller market teams. Like then I'll get asked like, hey, how come they paid so much? Well, because they're not next to right next to the Pacific Ocean and don't have 6 foot tall 6 foot blondes walking around everywhere. Not everywhere in Southern California. Not everywhere is going to be is going to be an attractive destination. Now I do realize that New York is always going to be New York, but in the bad years, they have to bring more to the table. I think they finally got it again. As I was saying earlier, I think they finally figured it out in terms of bringing in the right guy. You bring in a guy like Phil, it instantly adds to your credibility. Much like Amari, made them an attractive, landing place. Phil now makes them a much more at least intriguing landing place. So I'm with you.
Well, how much time do you think Dolan give?
Wait, I missed that. I'm sorry.
How much time do you think Dolan gives Phil Jackson?
If he's smart, he'll give him at least 2 full seasons. If he's smart, got to give him 2 full seasons because honestly, by year 2, I think you'll be able to make you make some noticeable. I think for one, I think you'll be able to make some significant improvements to the roster, and I think you'll see some noticeable improvements in terms of the overall play and overall basketball philosophy. If he's impatient, we may start hearing some murmurings or some rumblings, this season. But like I said, if he's got any sense to him whatsoever, he's going to let the guy do what he does, and that's build winners.
Yeah, I mean, he will build a winner. I mean, he hasn't the teams that. I mean, he hasn't. I don't think he has he obviously doesn't have the pieces yet. But when he was coaching, the pieces were already there. He didn't have to do any management or anything like that. I'm not downplaying what he did, but this is a completely new role from what he's used to doing.
Yeah, and that's actually what makes it exciting. And I hear you. He didn't have to go buy the groceries back in the day, and now he's responsible for that. But he is responsible for building winning cultures. Let us not forget. Mike was going down the first and second round of the playoffs. He was getting frustrated by teams like the Pistons. Now obviously the addition of Scottie Pippen helps. One of the greatest number twos that we've certainly seen over the last 30 or 40 years. But in Los Angeles, same thing. They had Shaq and Kobe. They had these players, but they were still getting frustrated. I remember the looks of frustration and the looks of just like exacerbation that each of them had when they were dealing with guys like Dale Harris and when they were dealing with guys like Rambis, whom I love as an assistant, but not so much as a head coach. So Phil is a guy that knows at least how to encourage or inspire a winning culture. In ways that we really haven't seen. I know the knock against him is he kind of had ready-made talent, but I always remind people that talent, yes, it was incredible, but though that talent hadn't won before him, and quite frankly, most of that talent didn't win after him.
I agree with that. That's been my argument with Phil is he was the only one that cooked. He did the cooking and did it correctly and made a good product. But that's the only question I have is does he know how to buy, because somebody else bought the groceries in those situations. Yeah, he made a meal that was probably prepared something Bobby Flay would make, but you look at from my perspective, I mean, I've just become so cynical over the years with how many how many times I've been told, okay, this is if you're going to give Donnie Walsh 2 or 3 seasons Phil Jackson, and he only gets 2 seasons. And you give Isaiah, what did he get, like 6 or 7?
I know, and I know that still hurts.
If he doesn't give Phil more than a good fair share of time, then James Dolan should be forced to sell the team like they did with Donald Sterling. I mean, not for the same circumstances, but he should be forced to sell the team. But how ridiculous that is.
Well, I look, I hear the frustrated fan in you. I do, believe me. They're not going to make him sell the team if he, unless he gets himself into some trouble. But I hear you. Like, if you give Isaiah and I want to differentiate Isaiah as a player than Isaiah as a front office guy. Isaiah as a player, it's funny because oftentimes there's blurred lines and people will just they almost take away from how great he was as a player because of how bad and how poor he was as a GM. But if you give Zeke that many years, you would think that you'd be at least smart enough to give, or have enough, smart people around you to tell you to give Phil, his due time. I only threw 2 years out there because I do realize the changing climate of the NBA. It used to be, where, a coach was given 3, 4, sometimes 5 years to see what they were made of. That's no longer the case. Same thing with GM, same thing with players. Like it's like literally what have you done for me lately? League, just like in society these days. But yeah, I agree with you. Dolan should say, Phil, what do you need? What do you want? And let me get the heck out of your way.
Looking at one more thing before I let you go. The Pacers. The whole thing last year was, as soon as Lance Stevenson and Paul George started taking over as leaders of the team, that's when everything went south. Mm-hmm. That was the rumor. It's hard to not buy into that rumor. It seems legitimate because those are 2 young guys. It was as soon as David West and Roy Hibbert stopped being the leaders that Hibbert's numbers go down. David, they don't have a veteran leader in the locker room. With this Pacers team, Stevenson's gone. Paul George might not be back. He says he'll be back in the playoffs. That's not going to happen.
He's going to go to the games? He's going to go watch?
I mean, he might watch, but he claims he might show up. He'll show up and maybe sit in the press box. Maybe not with Larry Bird anymore, but he might sit in the press box. But with this team now back under the leadership of Hibbert and David West, I'm starting to think that, they're not going to be a top flight team in the East. This is a gutty team. This is a scrappy team. I think people are underselling the Pacers right now just for that fact. Am I dead wrong on that, or do you agree?
No, I wouldn't say you're dead wrong. I will personally tell you that I don't have high expectations for them, but I would like to see a positive year. Now, what that translates out to, I'm not certain. If they can be tough, pound the post, maybe they could make a run. But honestly, when I look at this team, I also realize they're going to be dependent upon C.J. Watson to be like one of their main scorers. I also have a lot of different questions about, George Hill. Quite frankly, I don't have any questions. I think George Hill is a very good backup point guard, but and that Spurs system, can make you look a little bit better than what you are, especially if you're no longer going to be playing that particular system. And that's not a knock against George Hill. He's a very nice guy. It's actually a great interview. But I said that before last season. I thought they needed an upgrade at that position. Whether it was a split time situation or whatever the case may be. But yeah, when I look at that backcourt, and I really don't see, a lot, a whole lot of firepower. I don't see a lot of guys that I can rely upon. I think at the end of the day, Hibbert's numbers may improve. West, you pretty much know what you're going to get out of him. But I just don't see this as any type of world beater by any stretch.
Do you think Stuckey and C.J. Miles and even Luis Scola can kind of have a rejuvenation? Chris Copeland even. I'm not saying this is going to be a top 4 team, but this is going to be, I think they're not going to be inept or, a joke. I don't see that from this team.
No, I don't think they'll be terrible. I did think over the summer when it appeared they were flirting with the idea of moving Hibbert, I thought,